1953, the height of the Cold War. While the United States and the Soviet Union raced to build bigger nuclear bombs, American scientists were quietly asking a horrifying question. How much radiation is falling on the world and ending up inside our children's bodies? To find the answer, they launched a secret program with a deceptively cheerful name, Project Sunshine. What they did next would remain hidden for decades. They traveled the world collecting the bones of dead babies and young children, often without telling the parents, to measure how much radioactive fallout was poisoning humanity. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a fully declassified U.S. government program. You're listening to Archive Vault Podcast, where we open the sealed files and examine the government programs they hoped would stay buried forever. I'm your host, Joshua. Tonight, we uncover Project Sunshine. Welcome to the Vault. Everything you're about to hear is based on declassified Atomic Energy Commission documents, congressional investigations, and official reports released in the 1990s. No speculation, just the files. Now, let's go back to the early 1950s when fear of nuclear war drove the U.S. government to cross some very dark lines. By 1953, America had already detonated dozens of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. The Soviet Union was doing the same. Each test sent massive clouds of radioactive particles high into the stratosphere, where winds carried them around the entire planet. Scientists knew that one of the most dangerous byproducts was strontium-90, a radioactive isotope that mimics calcium. Once it enters the food chain, it gets absorbed into bones and teeth, especially in growing children. It can stay in the body for decades, increasing the risk of cancer and genetic damage. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, IAEC, needed hard data. They needed to know exactly how much strontium-90 was accumulating in human bodies worldwide. So they created Project Sunshine. The name was chosen deliberately and bright and optimistic to hide the grim reality of the work. The project was led by some of America's top scientists, including chemist Willard Libby, who would later win the Nobel Prize. In internal memos, Libby was blunt. They needed human tissue samples, and they especially wanted samples from young children and infants because their fast-growing bones absorbed the most radiation. The plan was simple on paper, disturbing in practice. Project Sunshine teams began quietly collecting bones and teeth from corpses across the United States, Britain, Australia, Canada, and other allied nations. Many of the samples came from stillborn babies and children who had died young. In some cases, pathologists removed bones during autopsies without informing the families. In other instances, hospitals and morticians were asked to send specimens with little explanation. The families often buried empty or incomplete caskets, never knowing that parts of their children had been shipped to laboratories in the United States. By the mid-1950s, Project Sunshine had collected over 1,500 human samples, many of them from babies. All of this was done under the highest levels of government secrecy. Project Sunshine wasn't just a small research effort. It was a coordinated international operation. The Atomic Energy Commission worked with scientists in Britain, Australia, Canada, and even South America. They set up collection networks in hospitals, morgues, and universities. Some doctors and pathologists were paid small sums or simply told it was for important national research. Internal memos from the project revealed just how calculated the effort was. In one 1953 memo, Willard Libby wrote that they should focus on babies and young children because their bones showed the highest levels of strontium-90. He even suggested that the ideal samples would come from infants who had died shortly after birth. In Australia, researchers collected bones from stillborn babies as young as a few months old. In the United States, samples came from cities as far apart as Chicago, New York, and San Francisco. British scientists sent bones from children who had died in hospitals across the UK. Many families had no idea what was happening. Parents would bury what they believed was their child's complete body, never knowing that ribs, femurs, or vertebrae had been removed and shipped thousands of miles away to U.S. laboratories. By the mid-1950s, Project Sunshine had gathered more than 1,500 samples. Some documents suggest the real number may have been significantly higher. The scientists weren't sadistic. They genuinely believed they were doing vital work to understand how nuclear fallout was affecting humanity. But the secrecy and the targeting of the most vulnerable made the program deeply disturbing. Even more shocking, some of the early nuclear test data used to justify continued atmospheric testing was based on these very samples. The government was essentially studying the damage its own bombs were causing, using the bodies of dead children. For years, the entire program remained hidden behind layers of classification. But in the 1990s, President Bill Clinton ordered a full review of Cold War human radiation experiments. That's when the full scale of Project Sunshine finally came to light. The public reaction was one of horror and betrayal. Project Sunshine remained one of the government's most closely guarded secrets for nearly 40 years. Then, in 1993, President Bill Clinton established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments to investigate decades of secret radiation studies on American citizens. When the committee dug into the archives, they uncovered the full horror of Project Sunshine. Declassified documents revealed that scientists had deliberately collected bones from babies and young children without consent. In some cases, families were misled or kept in the dark entirely. One particularly disturbing memo from 1953 discussed the need to obtain stillborns and emphasized that it would be best if the collections were done quietly. The report shocked the American public. Newspapers ran headlines like, "U.S. used dead babies' bones in secret radiation tests." Families who had lost children in the 1950s suddenly wondered if parts of their babies had been taken for government research. Some parents only learned the truth decades later. The revelations raised serious ethical questions. How could respected scientists, including Nobel Prize winners, justify harvesting body parts from the most vulnerable without permission? Where was the line between national security and basic human decency? The government eventually admitted that Project Sunshine, along with many other radiation experiments, had crossed serious ethical boundaries. In 1995, President Clinton issued a formal apology for the government's Cold War-era human radiation experiments. But for many families, the apology came far too late. Today, the full scope of Project Sunshine is still not completely known. Some documents remain heavily redacted or classified. Researchers believe the real number of samples collected may be much higher than the 1,500 officially acknowledged. The project also proved something deeply unsettling. During the frantic race to understand nuclear weapons, the U.S. government was willing to use the bodies of dead children as scientific instruments, all in the name of national security. Project Sunshine officially ended in the late 1950s as atmospheric nuclear testing was gradually phased out, but its impact lingered for decades. The data collected helped scientists understand how strontium-90 spread through the food chain and into human bones. It contributed to the growing pressure that eventually led to the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, which banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer space. Yet the ethical cost was enormous. The project became a symbol of government overreach during the Cold War. when national security was used to justify actions that would be considered unthinkable today. It joined a long list of other secret radiation experiments conducted on unwitting American citizens, including injecting people with plutonium and exposing soldiers to radiation without informed consent. In 1995, President Bill Clinton publicly apologized for these experiments, saying, "The United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong." But for the families whose children's remains were taken without their knowledge, the words offered little comfort. Even now, in the 2020s, some families are still searching for answers. A few have tried to locate where their children's samples were sent, but many records were destroyed or remain incomplete. Project Sunshine is more than just a Cold War science program. It is a stark reminder of what can happen when fear and urgency override basic human ethics. In the shadow of the nuclear arms race, the U.S. government secretly harvested the bones of dead babies and children to measure the poison falling from the sky, all while telling the public that nuclear testing was safe. The cheerful code name Sunshine now feels like a cruel irony. This case stands as a warning. Even the most brilliant scientists and well-intentioned national security efforts can cross dangerous moral lines when secrecy becomes absolute. The files are now open, the truth is known, but the questions remain, especially for the families who never got to bury their children whole. Thanks for listening to this episode of Archive Vault Podcast. Project Sunshine documents were declassified in the 1990s and are available through the Department of Energy and the Clinton-era Advisory Committee reports. If you want more episodes on dark government programs and declassified files, subscribe and join us next time as we open another file from the vault. Thank you for listening to Archive Vault Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful. Wishing you a great week ahead, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time.